Here's the full guide to making crazy beats for Yeat like Bnyx. A quick disclaimer, I'm creating this beat using techniques that Bnyx displays in hit songs like Talk, Flawless, Out the Way and What It Feel Like. I'm not trying to copy or recreate exact tracks or elements of tracks such as melodies or bass lines that Bnyx has already produced. To start this beat, I'm going to increase the tempo of the project to 139 beats per minute. I'm going to create the melody first, which is pretty standard for all producers making beats. I've taken a key from Pigments called Murmur and laid down power chords in the G flat minor scale. Power chords are created by taking the root note and the perfect fifth. Essentially, they are a major or minor chord, but without the third. The majority of Yeat's tracks feature power chords instead of triads. Now that I have the chords down, I've added a very simple top line melody using the same notes from the chords, but up an octave. I then assigned this to a mixer track and added the following effects. An EQ to cut out the sub 100 Hz lows. This prevents the melody from clashing with the bass line, which will be added later on. A thermal, which is a form of distortion and saturation, which gives the melody a more gritty and aggressive sound. A portal, which adds a small amount of reverb and an arpeggiated effect by adding a delay that plays notes from the pattern in higher octaves. And finally, an RC20 retro color, which adds multiple effects such as an old vinyl noise effect, wobble, which moves the pitch around very slightly, another distortion, a reverb, and magnetic, which modulates the volume of the melody slightly to give it a more real feel. Here's how this sounds. Now that we have the basis of the melody down, it's time to add some other subtle components. Firstly, I added a lead from Pigments called Hoppy and played this pattern at the end of the second, third and fourth bars. For the effects, I added a portal which stretches the sound out and an RC20 retro color for the same effect as the chords. I then took another preset from Pigments called Hailstorm and copied the chords across from the first pattern. I didn't add any effects to this apart from an EQ to cut the lows out. For the last sound I used in Pigments, I took a preset called Shooting Stars and played a very simple and repetitive counter melody. I used notes D and D flat to add tension and create an eerie vibe for the track. This is what happens when you play notes that are one semitone apart. I then used a different plugin called Serum to add a low mid frequency component to the melody. I took a bass preset called Mod Wheel Me and added a Campbell Crusher distortion, decapitator for saturation, and an EQ to cut all of the low bass tones from this pattern, almost playing this as if it were a brass section. Opening another Serum plugin, I took a lead preset to play in the background. I took the C16 lead from one of Bnyx's banks and created this pattern. I then used an effect that I use on a lot of my beats to avoid the leads from sounding too harsh and taking over the beat. I loaded up a fruity reverb and set the wet level to 100% and turned down the dry level significantly. This means that the dry input, so the original lead sound, is playing quietly, whilst the reverbed output is playing significantly louder and it pushes the lead into the background of the track. Lastly, I added this riser effect using the Old Faithful preset from X-Band 2, where I turned the attack and release down. This isn't necessarily something that Bnyx does, but it sounded good in this track. I nearly forgot to mention, I added a very simple sub bass for the intro using the Mod Wheel Me preset in Serum again. Altogether, here's how the melody sounds. Now moving on to the bassline and drums, I noticed that Bnyx's drums, specifically the 808s, seem to be more saturated than your typical trap drums. For me, this is why Bnyx's production hits different. I wanted to make sure that the drums for this track had the same effect. Starting with the 808, I took the Spins 808, which is by far the most used 808 in trap production. I laid down this pattern, which follows the root notes of the chord progression, and left a few gaps in the bass line as I wanted to add other bass elements into the track and didn't want these to overlap and make my mix sound muddy. When doing this, it's important to change the volume envelope of your 808 to look like this. This makes the 808 cut out as soon as the note ends. For effects, I added the Camel Crusher distortion to give the 808 more punch. I also added a soft clipper to the master to give the track a distorted sound. I then added a bass preset from Bnyx called Daft Razors and played this pattern, which again follows the root notes of the chords during the gaps in the 808s. And finally, I added the Corruptive Horizon bass preset from Bnyx for the end of this pattern. I added a thermal preset to this to add saturation. Here's how the bass line sounds. For the drums, I took the hit 1 hi-hat and laid down a simple 2-step hi-hat pattern and then added rolls to add variation. I then added a very simple snare pattern which hits on the 3rd and 7th beat using the incantation snare from my drum kit. I also added an accent note at the end of the pattern and added a very subtle reverb to this with a low wet level. I then decided to add another accent snare, which adds bounce and variation to the beat. And finally, I added an open hat, which hits on the 4th beat. Here's how the drums sound. Now that we have all of the components, it's time to structure the beat. There's no right or wrong way to do this, and Bnyx structures all of his beats differently. I decided to have an 8-bar intro with all melodic components and the synth bass line, and then take elements out of the next 8 bars which slowly get reintroduced before the drop on the 17th bar. Here's how the final beat sounds. Thank you for watching. If you learned anything from this video, please drop a like and subscribe. If you have any suggestions for my next tutorial or any questions, please drop them in the comment section below. See you in the next video.